In chapter 8 of Frankenstein, the focus is on the inner turmoil that Victor is going through as he contemplates the fact that Justine is about to lose her life because of his actions. The falsely accused, innocent victim Justine is about to die the death of a murderer, and Victor knows it's all down to him. He says, "All was about to be obliterated in an ignominious grave, and I the cause." Victor says he suffered living torture. In fact, it's clear that his emotions are beyond words when he says, "I cannot pretend to describe what I then felt." The focus here on horror and guilt and fear beyond description is another typically Gothic feature of the novel. And those abstract nouns appear again too, when by the end of the chapter, Victor says, "Torn by remorse, horror and despair, I beheld those I loved spend vain sorrow upon the graves of William and Justine, the first hapless victims of my unhallowed arts." Justine's trial and fate are certainly not just about Victor though. The clue is in her name. Justine, Justice, Justine. Some obvious wordplay going on here. When Justine goes on trial, Shelley is in effect putting justice or the judicial system on trial. The whole chapter is a criticism on Shelley's part of social institutions, the legal system on the one hand, but also the church. She actually uses the phrase mockery of justice at one point. Justine is perceived by others to be a monster, but appearances can deceive. The reality, as we're well aware, is very different. How many real-life cases fall victim to this kind of miscarriage of justice, this kind of misinterpretation based on prejudice and assumption? Justine's trial is a commentary on the injustice and corruption present in the judicial system, as well as foreshadowing the future injustices that we're going to witness in the course of the rest of the novel. The monster being the main victim, of course. It's not just the justice system that's corrupt, but the church too, though. Look at how negatively the priest is described, who eventually succeeds in eliciting a false confession from Justine. She lies under the threat of excommunication and hellfire, rejection from the church, and eternal punishment if she doesn't confess to a crime she's innocent of. Not exactly the kind of pastoral support and advice that Justine needs right now, but it's what she gets. The verbs besieged, threatened, and menaced present the priest as hostile, accusatory, and evil, rather than caring and comforting. As a victim, Justine is portrayed as particularly vulnerable and passive, as we perhaps expect her to be as a woman in this novel. She's dignified in the face of injustice to the extent that when she's visited by Victor and Elizabeth, we're told that the poor sufferer tried to comfort others. Her passivity is highlighted when she is resolved to submit in patience to the will of heaven. And her holiness and purity and piety are emphasised by references to her being a saintly sufferer. How does Victor respond to this? Well, he's very aware of his guilt. He says, "I, the true murderer, felt the never-dying worm alive in my bosom." It's as if he's being eaten alive by his guilt. He compares his plight to that of Elizabeth by declaring that she, in her innocence, is much better off than he is. He says Elizabeth also wept and was unhappy, but hers also was the misery of innocence, which like a cloud that passes over the fair moon for a while hides but cannot tarnish its brightness. This simile uses the imagery of light and dark to suggest that innocence is a light that he craves in his state of dark guilt. He yearns for the temporary fleeting darkness that the innocent experience in life, knowing that the darkness of his soul is unlikely to be alleviated by time. Victor goes on to say, "Anguish and despair had penetrated into the core of my heart. I bore a hell within me which nothing could extinguish." The depth of Victor's misery is evident here as he experiences a torment that only guilt can bring. Grammatically, his mounting anguish as we move towards the end of the chapter becomes increasingly evident in the number of exclamations in the narrative, 6 in the last 3 paragraphs, for instance. The bad news, of course, is that this is far from the end of it all. Ye weep, unhappy ones, but these are not your last tears. Again shall you raise the funeral wail, and the sound of your lamentations shall again and again be heard.